Good evening, and let me welcome you tonight to the forum at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. The panel discussion tonight is sponsored by the Kennedy School's Institute of Politics. Our guests are representatives of 3 public opinion research firms participating in the Americans Talk Security Project, and the individual who forged that bipartisan consortium, Alan Kay. Even if you haven't heard of the Americans Talk Security Project, the chances are those of you who are at least newspaper readers, if any, have seen their work. The project is producing 12 nationwide opinion surveys on American attitudes about national security during the 1988 presidential campaign, with the goal of stimulating public discussion about a broad range of national security issues. This is the first time that a project of this scope, depth, and political balance has been attempted in the United States, and the Americans Talk Security Project is already succeeding in influencing and helping to frame the national security debate. To introduce and to our distinguished panel tonight and to serve as the moderator is the founder of the Americans Talk Security Project, Mr. Alan Kay. Let me say a word about Alan. He was born in Newark, New Jersey in 25, left New Jersey at 18 to serve in the U.S. Army, including 6 months as an interpreter in Tokyo during the U.S. occupation. After leaving the Army, he came to Cambridge, where he received a B.S. in mathematics from MIT before crossing the river to complete a master's and a Ph.D. here at Harvard. His interest in security technology then led him to become the founder and vice president of TRG, a firm that specialized in research and development in navigations and communications, components and systems with contributions to sonar, laser, and nuclear technology. He's been involved in a number of other business enterprises, and he's currently president of Online Markets, where he is developing a strategic plan for security industries automation. In addition to his contributions to commercial and military technology and his work with Americans Talk Security, Alan is the co-founder and policy committee member and board member of Business Executives for National Security and a half-dozen other major public groups trying to provide public information about national security issues. So to introduce our panel and to moderate the panel, Alan Kay.
Thank you, Graham. It's a great pleasure and a real privilege for me and this project to be here tonight to communicate with you, I hope, our enjoyment and enthusiasm for being involved in this innovative and what turns out to be very significant series of 12 public opinion surveys, all devoted to the single issue of national security, scientific, 1,000+ sample telephone surveys that have been run in conjunction and contemporaneously with the presidential campaign of '88. The first survey was done in October of '87, and the last will be completed just after the election. The 8th survey has just come from the printer and is available over there. This is the first audience to see it in finished form. The surveys cover topical issues, trend questions, but much more important, the substance of the national security has been divided into a dozen parts, each of which are major issues for the electorate. And we have had the opportunity to ask in-depth questions on materials that no other project has had the opportunity to do. Let me go back now for a moment and explain what we mean by some of these things. Bipartisan, as Graham has said, is that we have an independent, a Republican, and a Democratic opinion research organization working together in the following fashion. There are 12 surveys. Each one of these organizations is responsible for one, so they do 4 altogether. The questions have to be approved by these 3 organizations, plus a 4th, which is a public agenda foundation, represented here also, for fairness, balance, and accuracy, and also by the project office, myself, and a small staff. So the 5 organizations were cooks in the kitchen. Then when the results come back, the analysis is again the responsibility of the organization performing the survey, but that also has to be approved for fairness, balance, and accuracy by all of the 5 organizations. It lends a lot of credibility to the result, and it does improve the quality of our work. Another important idea is that this is issue polling. We are surrounded by position or horse race polling. If the word is mentioned in connection with the campaign or during the campaign period, people immediately say, well, who's going to win, Bush or Dukakis? And we stay away entirely from that question. So we'll get into in a moment what are some of the subject areas we're involved in, but it's bipartisan in every way that we can possibly make it. Now, working with the candidates means that initially, when there were 12 and then 13 candidates, if you can remember back 7 months ago, we introduced ourselves and our project to each of them and got their cooperation in the sense that they gave us questions that they wanted answered in confidence on national security, and that we agreed to release results to the candidates before they were released publicly or into the media. Another important aspect of what we're doing is because this is a series, we can go back with, if there's any result that is confusing or not consistent with other results, we can go back in and ask related questions, and I hope we'll illustrate that to you tonight how to do that, to get a clearer understanding of where the public is than could be done by any single poll. Another important aspect is that everything we're doing is made public. The survey reports are distributed at no cost to every congressman, senator, and governor, and also to over 400 people in the media, political reporters, columnists, and editors, to all national policy organizations who requested it, left, right, and center, and there are over 400 of those, and to key individuals in the national security field inside the administration and out. And one of the things we achieved at an early point was commendations from well-known Republicans and Democrats on the importance of what we're doing and the value to them. I'm going to say one more thing about the role of the media, and then I'll introduce the pollsters and opinion researchers who will tell you how they have reacted to this opportunity. The media mediate between the candidates and, if you like, their advisors and some number of people who are close to them, whether that number is a few dozen or a few thousand, tiny compared to the whole public. And nothing gets out to the public that doesn't go through the media. The media has its own characteristics. We're also familiar with them. That may not be necessary to say it. But TV, which is the mass media distribution method of this society, has serious limitations on how issues can be presented. The candidates reach the public through the media, through debates and panels and commercials and 18 months of barraging the public with information about why they should be elected, including a great deal of information about where they stand on the issues, but also much more of the political activity. The going the other way of what does the public really know, understand, and believe about what the candidates have said is there's almost no channel whatsoever that's affected. Now that's confusing because we're all members of the public, and any candidate hears from 50, 100, several thousand people, almost in a continuous barrage. But when I'm talking about the public here, this is the best methods we have today for determining scientifically where the entire electorate is on any specific question. Now, aside from the issue polling that we've done, and a few policy organizations have also done, there is only one other major source of public opinion that we all get, and that is the polling that the media itself does. CBS, Time Magazine, or the CBS New York Times, CNN, USA Today, these little groups of very powerful TV and newspaper combinations give us our information. Some of it is issue results, but it all has to fit the media requirements, which is that those who are designing the poll are trying to figure out what questions are going to be uppermost in the public's mind in the next few days or the week when their results can come out. And they try to hit that on the head as close as they can. And that's fine, except what does it mean? It means that each week, or whatever short period is involved with them, they are only thinking about the future. There's no concern with what's been done in the past. There's no continuity. There's no effort to get back to here, to figure out the kind of in-depth understanding that they are. I want to now introduce our first speaker, who is Daniel Yankolovich, head of the Daniel Yankolovich Group, who are independent pollsters. As a matter of policy, they do no opinion research for political candidates. Dan, would you come to
I'd like to give you a picture from my own perspective of what the ATS data, American Top Security Data, says, and how the candidates are using it. I think all of us have a common point of view and a somewhat different point of view about how we are approaching this work. And my approach to it has been to see ATS as having two ambitions, one of which I feel has been successfully realized, and the other to a much lesser extent. You might think of it as a tactical ambition and a leadership ambition, in the sense of trying to give information that the candidates can use for purposes of exercising real leadership. On the tactical front, we thought it would be a service to the electorate if the candidates knew where the voters stood on this complex issue of national security and could therefore directly address their concerns. The national security issue from the public perspective is an exceedingly complex one because of the profound ambivalence of the electorate. There are at least 5 different elements to the electorate's thinking, which sets up a series of cross pressures for people and, of course, for the candidates. First, in the last few years, there has been a decisive shift of mood in the country. Maybe the best way to encapsulate it is very simply from toughness to negotiation. Over the period of the Reagan presidency, at the beginning of that period, for the first 3 or 4 years, by 3-to-1 margins, the public felt that the correct posture of the country was to be tough in dealing with the Soviets. And now it has reversed itself in a very dramatic reversal with a 3-to-1 majority in favor of negotiation against and in contrast to toughness and confrontation. I've tried to summarize all of that data in detail in the current issue of Foreign Affairs, and because of limited time, I'm not going to elaborate it, but I think that change of mood is one of the most faithful and decisive shifts in the history of the Cold War. Alongside of this change from toughness to a desire to negotiate is a persisting mistrust of the Soviet Union at a very high level. The view that they don't keep their word, that they lie, cheat, and steal, that they mistake conciliation for weakness, that they take advantage of every opportunity to exploit us. And that continues on and has, if you look back historically, during the period of détente in the 70s, people gave up those attitudes to an extraordinary degree. And then, when Afghanistan followed, the mistrust was reinforced and reinforced in such a powerful way that I think it will take at least a decade before that mistrust is dissipated, if everything works out to perfection. Third, there is a conviction among the public that American strength is a major factor in our success in dealing with the Soviet Union in the past year or two, and that the language of strength is the only one the Russians really understand and respond to. Fourth, concurrently with those views, however, is a very deep worry and concern that the high costs of defense are causing us to neglect the nation's social and economic underpinnings. And therefore, there is an anxious groping for some kind of relief from the demands of the defense budget. And fifth, the national security issue, having said all these things, is at a very low level of saliency in this campaign as compared to drugs, the economy, social problems of homelessness, children, and the like. For a very simple reason. There is a feeling that U.S.-Soviet relations are on the right track, that they're under control, and therefore there is no need to be as concerned with them as there is to be concerned with issues that are not under control. Now, these views are not necessarily incompatible or inconsistent, but they haven't gelled into any clear-cut pattern or hold. So people hold all five of them simultaneously, which makes for a very difficult situation for the candidates. For a candidate, treading one's way through these beliefs is truly walking on eggshells, because an overemphasis in any one of them could be fatal if it were seen as coming at the cost of one of the other beliefs. So you need to have the candidate juggling and not able to go to the preferred mode of encapsulating their views in a single slogan, because that will emphasize one aspect and the others will then come back to haunt them. So it's been possible, if you analyze the ATS data, to identify a number of booby traps. And part of our interest in this, analyzing this data, was to identify and flag these booby traps for the candidates so that they could avoid diverting the campaign away from real issues by making some mistakes. Let me give you some examples of what I would call true booby traps. Hailing the Gorbachev initiatives as a new détente in an enthusiastic fashion, which would immediately evoke the depth of the mistrust issue and be labeled as naive. Proposing to use defense dollars for other priorities, the Jesse Jackson position, which immediately is seen by the public as neglecting the issue of strength and the need to have this mistrust in the forefront of one's concerns. Catering to the mistrust and sounding the old Cold War themes, reiterating that old Cold War tom-tom rhythm as a violation of people's profound hopes for the future in this change. And I think that there is one particular booby trap for Mr. Dukakis, which is to fall into the trap either of reinforcing the pre-existing vulnerability of the Democrats of being soft on defense, or going to the other extreme and trying to out-hawk the conservatives to move to the right of George Bush on that issue. Now, by and large, the candidates have avoided these booby traps. A couple of weeks ago, I thought that Mr. Dukakis had fallen squarely into the trap of trying to out-hawk George Bush. These pictures in the tank, and taking a position that I am not weak. That's a disaster, that theme, I am not weak. I thought he recovered very well in last night's debate in the statement, I am for certain weapon systems, not for others. And so I think that he was able, he teetered very close to the edge of that particular booby trap. And I think that he was able to finally discredit it and to avoid it. Now, our second more ambitious goal was to use the ATS data to identify opportunities for leadership. And I think on this front, for a number of reasons, not because of any lack of merit in the data, but because of political realities, I think ATS has not done as well. In politics, timing is everything. The Cold War has lasted for 40 years. The ATS data and a lot of other data strongly suggest that Americans are ready to end it, but are very nervous about doing so, very afraid to do so. They're afraid of being naive, afraid of being taken advantage of, afraid of repeating the bitter experience of the détente of the 70s, and in a way there's no real widespread awareness of the extent to which America has won the Cold War. So we're still fighting a battle that, in a sense, we have, in some very important senses, we have already won. The Soviets seem even more eager to end the Cold War for their own very good reasons. From a leadership point of view, consequently, it seems to me that this campaign is a wonderful opportunity, could be a wonderful opportunity to prepare the country to turn our attention to a set of new priorities that urgently need the attention and the resources now being channeled to support a sterile and obsolete Cold War. Let me give you just one example. The new global economy is going to be a disaster for those Americans who don't have a good education and marketable skills. The prospect for them is a steady deterioration in their standard of living, the disappearance of good blue-collar jobs and the like. It's already happening. And amazingly, at least 50% of the young people of America are at risk. These are the forgotten half. So that the future prospect is that the top 50% will do better, and the bottom 50% will do worse. Well, if you go back to John Kennedy's image of a rising tide that raises all boats, the image today, it's a confusing and mixed one, but it's of the tide raising half the boats and sinking the other half, which is a formula for disaster, socially and politically, in this country. In my own personal view, and I'm speaking personally here, and I'm the neutral one, so I can say this, I don't think that either Mr. Bush or Mr. Dukakis have exercised a scintilla of statesmanship on leading the nation out of the Cold War era into the emerging era. Let me give you one specific. Host Graham Allison has a brilliant article in this issue of the Foreign Affairs, and in the middle of the article he refers to some Gorbachev initiatives. He says in 1986 Gorbachev confounded the experts by accepting the Western concept of an Atlantic to the Urals arms reduction zone. And next year, in 1987, he began to call the elimination of the capacity for surprise attack or offensive operations. That Gorbachev, in other words, called for building down conventional forces on both sides as a means of achieving parity rather than building up the pension force. And then Graham goes on to comment, I think very succinctly, quote, "It is an indictment of U.S. leadership that such a politically promising series of suggestions has been spelled out over the past 3 years by Gorbachev alone, essentially talking to himself." Well, he certainly is talking to himself from the point of view of this campaign, because even though Graham is purported to be an advisor to one of the candidates, there is certainly no evidence that that particular point of view has penetrated the Dukakis consciousness. But the reasons are very clear. They're political. As a liberal Democrat, Mr. Dukakis can't afford to do so because it would open him up to being savaged as weak on defense and communism. As a conservative, Bush could afford to take this position, but if he did so, it would deprive him of a partisan tactical advantage. Sad, perhaps, but we live in a period that I find extraordinarily nearsighted and tactical, and the chances are that statesmanship today might lay a giant egg. I want to conclude with two non-trivial consolations. Neither candidate has engaged in Gorbachev bashing or in the old excessive Cold War rhetoric, for which we should all be grateful, because it leaves the possibility after the campaign of moving ahead in a somewhat more commonsensical fashion, even though it forgoes the opportunity for dialogue and education and leadership during the campaign. And Mr. Dukakis, secondly, has given expression to an important ATS finding, namely that Americans have finally come to realize that economic strength is as important to our national security as military strength. In brief, then, ATS has realized its ambition to keep the campaign from being deflected by one or another candidate falling into a booby trap on this complex issue of national security. It has not yet, at any rate, realized its ambition of making leadership less politically precarious, making true leadership. The theme is constant there, but the evidence of it certainly is not dramatically accepted. But this goal of using this kind of data to do so, to show where the country, the direction in which the country is moving, that calls for some kind of true statesman and leadership opportunities, I think is a noble goal for which Alan Kay's inspiration to found a project of this sort is to be thanked. And I would want to go ahead with this kind of goal, however slim the chances of successfully achieving it may be. Thank you very much.
Just before we proceed, for those of you who have filled out one of our sample questionnaires, pass them down and we'll collect them to see if we can do a tally, and by the end of the evening perhaps be able to give you a comparison between the elite and the general public. Which is which? And while that's going on, I'll introduce our next speaker, who is Fred Steeper, the Senior Vice President of Market Opinion Research at Detroit and Washington, who have been pollsters for every Republican presidential candidate in the last 6 elections, 5 of which were successful, a rather imposing record. Fred has handled surveys number 2 and 5 and 9, which is completed, will come out in a few weeks. And his colleague, who started with him in the survey work, Bob Teeter, and has been working closely with us too, is one of the top 2 or 3 people in the Bush campaign. And my experience with Bob Teeter puts me in awe of what that campaign is able to do. Red? How have we done with collecting these surveys? Go ahead.
I want to very briefly describe to you what I have considered a major surprise this year as a student of public opinion, and also what has transpired to be a major disappointment to the Bush campaign. And it has to do with the political payoff and the lack thereof from the INF Treaty and summitry in general and the thawing of the Cold War. I think, and going back to a year ago and looking towards this year and what might happen in terms of meetings with Gorbachev, the signing of the treaty, and the thawing of the Cold War, there was expectation that this would put in place alongside of prosperity the peace, and the Republicans would have the peace and prosperity for 1988, which is a surefire winning combination. The surprise that we began to see with, I think, ATS number 2 and number 3, which was after Gorbachev's visit to the U.S. in December, was that there was not a noticeable change in the public's perceptions of Ronald Reagan's job performance in general or in his handling of foreign policy. And the reason those two perceptions are relevant for the 1988 race and talking about political payoffs and incentives is that there's a very strong correlation between the Bush-Dukakis race and people's perceptions of Ronald Reagan. To a very strong degree, it's not going to come as a great surprise. This election is a referendum on the Reagan years and the Reagan policy. Those who want to change it are voting for Dukakis. Those who want to continue it or build on it, both the Republican rhetoric, are voting for Bush. So the theory was, and I think it's accurate, that if Reagan could improve the public's perceptions of his job performance as President of the United States, that would, in a second step, help George Bush's political strength vis-a-vis whatever Democratic opponent he chose. Reagan took a terrible beating with the Iran arms sale after '86, and he's never fully recovered. What we were looking for was with summitry, the INF, the START talks would bring back a recovery on Reagan's part and maybe return him to the Teflon president that he never really was. But that, with the ATS surveys, we've established that the INF agreement was very popular, had very strong support by the American public, although they had reservations and a certain amount of skepticism. They were for it. They're also for START. They want a reduction by 1/2 of strategic nuclear weapons. They supported the summit. The first summit, they thought it wasn't a great success, but it was a minor success. They were more positive about the summer summit, while Dan mentioned that they still have a skeptical attitude about the Soviet Union. If you compare their perceptions now to 5 or 10 years ago, while those perceptions are still negative and cautious, they're not anywhere near as hostile as they used to be 5 or 10 years ago. You can definitely see in the ATS data a thawing of the Cold War, if it's defined in terms of Americans' perceptions of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev himself as a leader is a popular leader. In no way is seen as a villain. The ATS, one of our side findings, that the villains in the world today are Gaddafi and Khomeini. They get the truly unfavorable ratings. Gorbachev gets a very good rating among the American public. But despite all that, the thawing of the Cold War, the first real major breaks in terms of relations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union did not result. Those are all good, and maybe some will resent I'm putting all this in a political context, but that's my profession. In terms of politics, there doesn't seem to be any payoff there. And what you should ask yourself, if there's no political payoff, what is the political incentive for signing treaties? Now, we do know that there are political payoffs, and I'll say this crudely to make the point, there are political payoffs to bombings. but are there political payoffs to signing treaties? And what should be disturbing is that so far there hasn't been one. Maybe eventually, before the election, Bush and the Republicans can make the case that there needs to be a continuation of a Republican president in order to continue the peace process that Reagan began. And I'm sure they will try to make that argument. Another little twist of irony to this, as you know, the Republicans had problems with women for the past 6 to 8 years in terms of Reagan and the Republican Party's stand on the issues. You would think by accomplishing as much as Reagan has done in terms of thawing the Cold War, the two treaties, that would have improved Reagan's perceptions among women. It didn't. In fact, one of the interesting findings that we've in the ATS theories, in the ATS series, is that women tend to be a little bit more distrustful of the Soviet Union than men are. They tend to be a little bit more negative about Gorbachev than men are. It turns out that somehow Reagan just reinforced his male support and didn't help out improving his perceptions by women. Very interesting side note, and it has something to do, I don't think we have a full explanation of this, but it has something to do with women being more risk averse. There's a certain risk involved in signing treaties with the Soviet Union and talking with your enemy, and we're finding that men tend to be a little bit more willing to do that than women are. So while the stereotype of women being more interested in peace and therefore signing treaties and so forth should help a politician more with women than men, we find actually that the reverse is taking place. So the general question that I just wanted to raise with you briefly was, aside from the good points in what's happened this year, just substantively, looking at it from a political perspective, it's been very surprising that there hasn't been more of a payoff to really the great achievements that have taken place in the past 6 months or so in terms of U.S.-Soviet relations. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. And our final speaker on the panel, John Martilla of the Democratic polling firm of Martilla and Kiley, who are also polling for Mike Dukakis. You might wonder, how did I succeed in getting the firms that are polling for the two winning candidates when we started back when there was no incumbent, no clear front runner? And I just will take any credit you would like to give me for wisdom, but I'll settle for just being lucky. It certainly has given us a direct access of our results into the campaigns, and 8 copies go FedEx for the Bush campaign, and the next morning they're studying them, and many stories like that. I can turn the floor over now to John Martilla, who will give a Democratic perspective.
Thank you, Alan. I hope you won't mind this indulgence, but whenever the caucus people gather, we normally begin the meetings with the Pledge of Allegiance. What I would like to do is, first of all, pay further praise to Alan Kay. This has been an extraordinary undertaking this year. Alan has invested his own money in what I thought at the time was a crazy idea a year ago when he came to me and said that he thought the American people should be represented in this election. I said, Alan, cut it out. Nobody cares about that. Now, what's happened is that it was a very idealistic notion, and so idealistic that I was skeptical of it, frankly. I didn't believe this process could really work. But frankly, I believe these surveys have given voice to the people. And we have just completed our 9th national survey. All of these surveys are on national security issues. They are, as you know, they are being conducted by 3 different organizations. And 4,000 copies of every single survey are produced and distributed to the national news organizations, as Alan said, every member of the House and the Senate, and presidential campaigns. And I believe what's happened is that increasingly people have paid more and more attention to this, and I think the ATS data has tipped off news organizations and campaigns to some of the most important developments that the people were thinking about. Not the campaigns, but their expressions, their concern. Particularly, their concern about international drug trafficking, which I believe sort of blindsided most of the national political leadership of this country, emerged in large measure, at a fully salient level, I think, through the ATS surveys. And I think Alan has done a wonderful work, and I believe that years from now, we'll be able to look back at this body of knowledge, which is 12 national surveys, and continue to draw extremely important lessons from them. I think what it has done has been an extraordinary privilege for me. As you may know, Republicans spend millions and millions of dollars on this kind of activity all the time. Democrats generally take one or two local surveys once a year. So for the first time, as a Democrat, we have a chance to find out what America's thinking out there. And I've learned a great deal. And I believe 9 surveys later, I'm beginning to understand the values of the American people on national security issues. And speaking as a Democrat and a liberal Democrat, I am reassured by their values. I believe that they, as they look at the world, there's a lot of common ground. They're not liberal values or conservative or Republican and Democrat. They're American values. And I think what the Republicans have skillfully done, and this is praise, not criticism, is they have, in a very real way, they have expropriated American values and called them Republican values. And the truth is, these are American values, and we talk about some of these ideas tonight. Maybe I can give you a little better sense of that. First of all, if you want to understand American values towards the world in the 1990s, you must begin with U.S.-Soviet relations. There are 2 wonderful articles that are in the current edition of Foreign Affairs, one authored by our colleague Dan Yankolovich, which is a wonderful look at current American thinking about U.S.-Soviet relations with a clear historic perspective, looking back toward the 1970s, during the optimism of the détente, and then moving through the 1980s. It's a terrific grounding document. The second is Graham Allison's article about how to take this issue to Gorbachev during the 1980s. I think both articles are wonderful, but they speak to a point which is absolutely fundamental. For those of you in this crowd who are fellow travelers, like I am and was, as a liberal Democrat, I don't think you can fully appreciate how deep the water runs on U.S.-Soviet relations. It is a fundamental preoccupation of the American people. It is a prism through which they look at the world. And I wrote an article earlier this spring in which I described the U.S.-Soviet relationship as the gateway for American national politicians. And if an American national leader could not pass through this gateway and reassure the American people that he shared their values on U.S.-Soviet relations, he would be unable to get to the other ground of other issues, international drug trafficking, world economic competition, and the rest of the international issues. It is a fundamental test of American political leadership. If you are seen to be naive on U.S.-Soviet relations, you are not going to be fully trusted. And the 2 most widely celebrated political gaps in the past 15 years deal with U.S.-Soviet relationships. In 1976, Gerald Ford, in the famous remark in 1976, said that Eastern Europe was not under the domination of the Soviets. And in 1980, President Carter committed an equally grievous gap when he said that the invasion of Afghanistan was one of the most revealing episodes about the relationship with the Soviet Union. The American people looked at both of these remarks and just said, this is ridiculous. These people are naive about the fundamentals about the Soviet relationship. And the cornerstone of the relationship, which has been expounded in a book by Dan, is, I think the American people, when they look at the Soviet relationship, they're not screaming hawks. They are extremely worried, and they are completely committed to ongoing negotiations with the Soviets to reduce the threat of nuclear war. That is a fundamental American value. It is deep-seated. The Democrats have taken too much solace by embracing that alone. But next to that, they also believe we must negotiate with the Soviets from strength, and we must negotiate with them step by step, very cautiously. And if you want to think about that triangle, those are the American values in the U.S.-Soviet relationship. And unless you speak to those issues successfully, unless you pass through that U.S.-Soviet gateway, in my estimation, I do not believe you'll be fully trusted as an international leader. And frankly, I think it has been Achilles' heel of the Democratic Party for the past 20 years. They have never fully understood this. And because of intellectual laziness, they have not spent the time to study the values of the American people, and to trust the people, and listen to them, and try to understand their values so that we can move forward. This issue, I totally agree with Dan. I think this is a unique moment. I think we can move this issue forward. But if you're going to move the country forward, you have to understand from where the country begins. So it's fundamental. And also, second, if you want to understand U.S.-Soviet relations, disabuse yourself of notions about who thinks what about the Soviets. One of the most useful ways we have found to organize attitudes about the U.S.-Soviet relationship is to divide the American electorate into four quadrants. College-educated men, non-college-educated men, college-educated women, and non-college-educated women. And just to understand the statistics behind them, men without a college education represent 32.6% of the electorate. Women without a college education are 39% of the electorate. Women with a college education are 13%, and men with a college education are 14%. So the largest audience within those four quadrants is women without college educations. And surprise, they're also no surprise, they're the most democratic. Men with college educations are the most Republican. But when you look at their attitudes about U.S.-Soviet relations, what you find are the most hopeful, the most praiseworthy of Gorbachev, the most optimistic about U.S.-Soviet relations is the most Republican audience, college-educated men. The most skeptical, the most suspicious, the most democratic audience is women without college education. How skeptical? Let me read you a few questions. In 1984, Dan's firm participated in a wonderful national survey, which was one of the famous benchmark measurements of American attitudes towards U.S.-Soviet relations. In that survey, they asked the following question. The Soviet Union is like Hitler's Germany, an evil empire trying to rule the world. And I cannot recall this, but I think it was 55-38 agreement in 1984. Today, the statistics have nearly reversed, 38-53. People disagree with this notion. So that's one indication of change that Fred was talking about. Men with college educations reject this notion 3-1, 24-73. Women with college educations reject it 30-70. Men without college education reject it 38-60. And women with college educations accept this notion 49-46. 49-46. Women without college education believe today, this year, the Soviet Union is like Hitler's Germany, an evil empire trying to rule the world. Is Gorbachev sincere in his call for sharp reductions in U.S. and Soviet nuclear weapons? Men with college, 79. They agree to everything, by the way. They are the wimps of the U.S. foreign policy. Women with a college education, 64-27. Men without a college education, 62-26. Women without a college education, 42-40. And will we fight the next 10 years someplace in the world? The electorate rejects this notion. Women without college education, 39% of the electorate, overwhelmingly Democrat, they say, yes, we are, 50-47. They reject this notion. So, when you think about notions of the gender gap, notions of war and peace, we don't know what America is thinking. And I think that there's a very high correlation between, as you move up the income and education ladder, what you find is increasing optimism and hope about the U.S.-Soviet relationship, increasing praise for Gorbachev, and as you come down the income and education ladder, what you find are greater skepticism. Now, obviously, there's a correlation between economic vulnerability and suspicions of the world, but speaking as a democratic strategist, what you find, the most critical audiences of the U.S.-Soviet relationship are blacks, are lower-income whites, non-college educated women. And some of the audiences which have moved most dramatically in the past month of the presidential campaign are some of these classic democratic audiences. So this is a fundamental reality of American public life, and I think it's an issue that we do not fully understand. And I certainly didn't understand it until Alan's tremendous project here. Dan mentioned briefly, I'll quickly touch upon the rest of these issues, but I know you have a lot of questions to us. The salience of national security. I'm not sure if I totally accept Dan's notion that this issue is unsalient this year, if there is such a word to make up with. We had asked two questions in the ATS series. The first was asked by the Yankolovich organization at ATS 3. What are the great issues facing the next president? And the country was given four choices: the economy, social issues, restoring American values, or national security. National defense finished last. So we went back at this question in the most recent ATS survey, and we cut the choices, three choices this time: the economy, social issues, and defense. And then we had a follow-up question, which was for those people who selected the basic question is, what do you want the next president to deal with, the economy, social issues, or defense? For those people who selected the economy and social issues, we said, what if you believed the other candidate was more qualified to deal with our national defense? What would your conclusion be? And And among those people who picked the economy, 35% either pulled away from their original choice by becoming undecided or switching votes. And among those people who picked social issues, 44% backed off. So I think that where this issue, the salience of this issue, is someplace, my own personal interpretation is that it is a more salient issue at the presidential level than it is being given credence for in all the national survey research. In terms of the Reagan legacy, another great Democratic myth, I'd like to expose these Democratic myths. For years, the Democrats have been asking, should we spend more or less on the Defense Department budget? The country always came back and said, spend less, and we took great solace in that. We go out these national campaigns, state Senate campaigns, we say, spend less. And somehow the country did not respond. So market opinion research in one of our first surveys suggested we ask the question, was the Reagan military buildup necessary or unnecessary? This is the question we've asked 4 times to try to shake it up and challenge in every possible way. And basically what you find is that 2/3 of the American people believe the Reagan military buildup was necessary. And therefore, when you think about challenging overall defense priorities, these are not sacred positions. You can move these positions. I'm not by any means saying a political leader should be subservient to poll results. I'm saying if you want to move the American people, understand their values, find out where they are, and then lead them. And I think what's going on right now is Democrats and many other people who care about this issue have never fully understand that 2/3 of the people believe this defense buildup was necessary. Secondly, we asked a series of issues about Reagan's legacy. We asked a series of questions on 19 foreign policy issues. How he had done on the U.S.-Soviet relationship, strong defense, standing up to the Soviets, bringing arms control. Reagan did wonderfully well. 7.5 years into his presidency, his approval ratings on those issues were better than 70%. He was sharply criticized for severe negative ratings for his dealings with Central America, international drug trafficking, and so forth. So by the standard measures that we have judged presidents for the past 40 years, Ronald Reagan received wonderful ratings by the American people. On the more contemporary issues, he receives less wonderful ratings. To me, the question is, which is still an open question in my mind, as we move towards Election Day, which will be more salient? Will the old, golden oldies, Soviet relationships, strong defense, be more salient than some of these new issues? And I'm not sure. I believe that there is great power to the notion that we are moving towards greater peace with the U.S.-Soviet relations. I will close with one last great finding of the ATS surveys. One of the things we've done consistently, we've asked the American people, what are the greatest threats to national security? We've asked it in many different ways, through many different surveys, different questions, different techniques. And what has happened is consistently, international drug trafficking has emerged as #1 finding throughout the ATS series. The spread of nuclear weapons to third world countries has emerged. And the American people, when they're given closed choices, they generally say these are much greater threats to U.S. national security than the threat of Soviet expansionism. But the one great issue, which is clearly emerging and will be one of the dominant issues in the 1990s, and I believe will be the full equal threat of U.S.-Soviet relations, is our ability to compete in the international economy. And the most consistent that we were finding, we asked people, what is the greater threat? Economic competition from our economic competitors like Japan, or threats from our military adversaries like the Soviet Union? We've asked this question 2 or 3 different times, and consistently people say the future economic threat of these economic competitors is the greatest challenge. But we asked one great question, one very revealing question, which I will close with. We asked the American people to evaluate American standing in the world economy. The first time we got a response from it, we just didn't believe the results, so we asked it again. The results came back identical. 22% of the American people believe that the United States is the #1 economy in the world. 33% believe we have less economic power than Japan or West Germany, and 44% believe we have equivalent economic power to countries like Japan and West Germany. Which means today, 1 month ago, 77% of the American people believed that we were only equal to the economic power of Japan and West Germany, or we had less power than they did. Now, I personally believe, most economic experts, I think, agree with me, that we are the #1 economy in the world. But if you want to think about the American mentality, as they look at this world we live in today, which is increasingly complicated and more difficult, what they are looking at is an America with much less economic power. And increasingly what's happening is Americans are redefining notions of national power with economic power. And these are moving together, and I think that represents, for the past 4 years, the schism, the dichotomy has been East-West, U.S.-Soviet. I think as we move into the 1990s, as we leave this conceptual framework, I think we're moving into new territory, and I think economic competition will be an increasing part of our definition. Of course, that would not be possible if people did not believe the Soviets had become more predictable adversaries, that we were not making progress, and Gorbachev was not doing such a good job. So it's a different world. I don't think we can move into these new issues without the assurance that the Soviet relationship had stabilized. So anyway, I will close with this, and you can ask questions later.
We're going to go into a question and answer period, but first I'll give the panel privilege of questioning each other. And if their brains are not stimulated at the moment, we'll go to the audience, and maybe they'll respond. If you want to ask a question, I believe the practice is to go to either one of these two microphones, right? And on the second floor, there are two others. And we have a gentleman here.
John Marcella. I'm surprised that haven't I seen statements in the press that the American people consider AIDS the number one problem facing the country? On defense, I'd like to ask you, could a pollster fashion questions of experts? Now, a question like the effectiveness of Star Wars doesn't depend entirely on a straw poll as you walk down the street. We hear from people like Caspar Weinberg and Edward Teller that Star Wars will work, but I think that I've read also that a lot of scientists, probably a heavy majority, do not think that Star Wars will work. So if the American people are going to decide what is an adequate defense, they need to know whether Star Wars is workable, whether perhaps 2,000 nuclear warheads would deter any rational enemy if Star Wars doesn't work and if mutual assured destruction is going to remain effective for the next 40 or 50 years. Now, as far as who should get credit for the remarkable change in U.S.-Soviet relationships, the question is whether Ronald Reagan has really led that effort. I believe the number one hero of the change in the U.S.-Soviet relations is sitting in this room. I think Professor Roger Fisher has done more than any other human being to work that change. He was my candidate for president in 1984. I still think it would have been a good idea. But I want to ask you, would it be feasible to ask the experts, will SDI work? And wouldn't that then affect the follow-up as to how much we should be spending on defense? I welcome comments from many of the others on the panel.
Well, our province is to try to understand the values of the American people, and so we did not survey the experts. We did not ask any questions about AIDS. Virtually all of our questions dealt with national security issues. But I will comment on Star Wars. What Star Wars, in the ATS surveys, we've asked 4 or 5 different questions about Star Wars, and our information has tracked pretty closely the historic data on this. Since going back to the mid-1980s, the American people have supported Star Wars, and by margins of roughly 55 to 35, which have deteriorated to something like 51-39 in the final ATS measurement. And I think that critics of Star Wars have failed to understand the mythological hold this issue had on the American people. American people believe in peace through strength. They believe in American technology. And in many ways, this was Reagan's answer to successful antidotes for freeze movement. I think it is an issue with latent popularity which has psychological components to its appeal. And I don't think the critics of it have been extremely lazy. The critics who, I include myself as one of them, they have never taken the time to educate the American people about its classic vulnerabilities, and they have failed to fully understand how popular this was. As a consequence, by dismissing it out of hand, they allowed Star Wars popularity, I think, to achieve even higher levels.
Yeah, the question was, would polling the experts and feeding their information to the public change the public's view or influence it? And I don't think it would. First of all, the experts aren't that unified, and people will choose the answer. That's what they've been doing, choosing the answer, because experts have been testifying on this issue very voluminously. But I think one of the questions, one of the aspects of the public that frustrates the experts is the faith in technology is such that the argument that it won't work cuts almost specifically, this is something very difficult for experts to understand, but that there is a different worldview and set of beliefs, and particularly when it comes to issues of technology.
The American public also has in mind stopping just a couple missiles delivered by some lunatic in the third world, and in that context, space shield may work. But you have that in mind. In fact, that is the chief way they think a nuclear war would start. Who would be the first person to use it?
Lady on the left.
Hi. I'd like to go back to the issue of salience, on which Dan Yankolovich and John Martilla actually disagreed somewhat. Maybe see if they disagree more. And this question of economic security versus military security. It seems to me that maybe there is a gateway which is kind of a negative condition. The international economy may be a factor of much higher salience, but if a candidate, presidential or otherwise, rates negatively on the military scale, that becomes a condition for even being able to enter the fray on the economic issue. And I'd appreciate it if all three of you could address that.
Well, that's my contention when I said that presidential candidates uniquely does not apply to candidates who run for the U.S. Senate or for the House or for governor. They have to, in my belief, they have to reassure the American people that they share their values on some of these fundamental defense propositions. And if they don't establish that basic bona fides for people, then they are less credible on these other issues, no matter how critical these issues are. I think it's unknowable right now, based on the ATS data. I don't think we know how salient the issue of national security. Fortunately, Dan's company in ATS 10 and 11, and the survey we take after the election, is going to make a mighty effort to look even further at the issue of salience to understand it better. My guess is I think it's more of a salient issue in this campaign than the popular polls would suggest.
I don't have any quarrel with John. I was using salience in this sense. It's known in polling circles for decades that the public at any one time entertains about 2.5 issues in the top of their mind. So you push one in, another one goes out. So I always have thought of saliency in terms of that model. That could the candidate have ignored this issue and concentrated on some other issues? And the answer is yes. This year. In other years, it's been inescapable. You couldn't do it in 1980. It was one of the major reasons for Ronald Reagan's success. The logical relevance of the issue and the interrelationship between the economic and the military is so direct that the issue is going to come in through the back door any way you define it. As soon as you begin to talk about other priorities and other concerns, this massive, expensive expenditure on defense and the distraction of the Cold War is the major obstacle to dealing with a lot of other issues, on the premise that the nation does have a limited attention span. Just like any business or any organization cannot work, even the Kennedy School, cannot work on multiple priorities at the same time. And to that extent, I was saying that it's not salient, but that is not in any way contradictory to what John says.
I'll fall somewhere here. The other way. I think what we're finding in terms of issue concerns, it's very fragmented. We're not in an election situation where there's clearly one dominant issue. There are constituencies of equal size for about a dozen issues, ranging from AIDS and homeless to national security and the environment and drugs and so forth. What remains to be seen over the course of the last 6 weeks of the presidential campaign is, I tend to agree with Dan to a certain extent on this, it'll really come down to 2 or 3 considerations, and I don't think this campaign has worked itself out as to what 2 or 3 questions the 2 candidates were on everybody's mind. I don't think they have selected those last 2 or 3, and whether national security will be one of those 2 or 3.
I'd like to add that the reason drug trafficking got into our surveys, which is supposed to be on national security, it came about as follows. We started with a narrow definition of national security, those issues which were military or could or might involve the military. That's why I feel comfortable about saying that national security is whatever our president says it is, because he is the person who decides when military might is going to be used or proposed. Now, in international drug trafficking, there are certain solutions. Sending U.S. troops to eradicate drugs growing in fields in foreign countries, or sending in the UN, and that gave us legitimacy for putting that in contention with other issues, and that's where beginning in March we found it at the top of the charts. It has been on our surveys, 3 since, and many others. Now we have another question from Ms. Yankolovich.
Concerning what Steve was saying about women trusting Gorbachev or the Soviets less as compared to men in the surveys that were done. Well, in my friend's experience, we've met people from the USSR, and they tell us about a way of life that maybe to them it didn't cause them death, but it caused them much distress. And when Reagan mentioned, the time that he mentioned the Soviet Union was an evil empire, it even struck me kind of funny, because I'd love to trust the Soviets. I'd like to trust them as long as they can trust us. But in a more personal sense, what would any of you say to the fact that in the survey many women trust the Soviets less? I think, in my opinion, in my experience, people from the USSR, those who have the courage to talk about their experiences there as ordinary citizens, feel that they should not be trusted. Why should, let's say in this country, men be so trustful more than women, not in general? If we have immigrants telling us that life there is not too great, even for free expression, despite glasnost and perestroika coming into being.
Can I handle that?
I've never been able to understand the gender gap. I am quoting a statistical difference. Why? And I gave a possible explanation that it had something to do with one's willingness to take a risk. And I thought all along the gender gap had to do with Reagan setting new directions and representing a greater than average risk in the case that he represented, and men were willing to support that and take a chance, and women were more conservative in the sense of being more cautious and prudent. And Reagan has never been a cautious, prudent type of president. And I mean, that's been my explanation. And I come back to what I said before, it is risky business sitting down with your enemy or somebody who's been your enemy for 40 years and trying to come to an agreement with somebody you have said you could never trust. And I think men are willing to make that gamble just a little bit more. We're only talking 10 or 15%, men being more likely than women. I think it's been more identified now. It's not college women versus college men, but we're finding it more with non-college women, less educated women. We're the most conservative and risk averse when it comes to these foreign policy things.
I share with Fred a temerity to plunge into the subject of gender gap, but I'll just add a few tidbits. On the economic issues, as John said, that the same group of women tend to be Democratic. And one reason that they are so Democratic is because the economic issues are affecting them more directly. They're hurting more in a very direct way, making ends meet and the like. So that part of, if you look at the domestic issues, if we get away from foreign policy issues, the other side of the gender gap, you see, is one where it has favored the notion of change, because this Reagan administration has not been great for this group on the economic front. A number of other surveys on tracking social change have borne out Fred's hypothesis that the non-college educated women are the most conservative, in the sense that tracking social change, the first group that is likely to change in the society are young, college-educated men and women. And the last group to change are the older, poorer, non-college educated women. So that what we're talking about in taking this snapshot is not a picture of the future, it's a picture of the present. Because the pathway of acceptance of social change shows that this group catches up in about 2 years. And I think that some of the attitudes that we see in the other groups are predictive of the attitudes of this group in a few years, and that would fall in with being risk averse and being conservative. So that's a little larger perception of it, but all said, it is not the crystal ball is very cloudy.
I'd just like to say that some of the ATS project people are not concerned about with temerity, and we have scheduled 2 focus groups of non-college women, and we will get much better understanding of these problems in the next week. We have our first person in the balcony up there. Questions?
Yes, I'm Tim Takaro. Mr. Yankolovich may have addressed this question with his 2.5 issue law, but I'd like to ask the other panelists. As Mr. Martillo stated, the public is very unsatisfied with the Reagan policy in Central America, particularly in Nicaragua. And it was stated that this election is a referendum on Reagan policy. Why has the Dukakis campaign not taken a greater issue with Central American policy?
Well, I think the governor's actually been quite outspoken in Central American policy, not just this year, but for most of his political life. He's very outspoken on it. I think there are other indications in the ATS survey data which would argue that it's a more complicated situation. Ortega is widely known, is well known by the American people. He's ranked in the least liked. There are 5 figures who America dislikes the most: Ortega, Gaddafi, Khomeini, Castro, and whatever it was. And secondly, Fred's firm does a study on theoretical foundations of anti-communism as a foundation for Central American policy. And I was struck by there was more support for theoretical notions of anti-communism than exist in the public surveys, which just take a look at up and down Central American policy. So, I think the last place you criticize the Dukakis campaigns for being outspoken in Central America. I think they've spoken about it that land. Might have spoken about it. Yeah.
Any other comments on that one? Let's turn to this gentleman.
This is more of a devil's advocate question, and it deals more with the issue of polling than it does of national security. I think, as you stated, the purpose of this poll is to have a dialogue between the candidates and the American public. And I'd like to suggest, or question, whether it is dialogue or whether you are providing a valuable but one-way service for the candidates, and that it informs the candidates very well of the opinions of the American public. But the reverse, I don't think, is necessarily true. And I'd also like to question, maybe it is possible that I wonder if there is a similar adequate way for the American public to discern the positions of the candidates. I think if you saw the TV last night, it's rather difficult to figure out. And I will suggest that this gives the candidates a very valuable method to adjust their public positions to what your polls say, but their private positions may not be the same. And I guess I'd like to ask Mr. Yankolovich, since he has been doing these polls for a number of years, but what are your thoughts on how these polls are used? Since you don't have any control over, they are a valuable service, but you do not have any control over how they are used. And I'm concerned that they may be providing the candidates with a way to adjust their public positions, but they still have the same private positions and they may be different.
I may be the wrong person to ask that question because I don't do any polling for the candidates, perhaps implicit in some of your observations about control over the results. But I think that over the years it's been very clear cut that polls are used in two ways. They're used manipulatively by the candidates who follow, and that's the accusation that the candidates follow the polls, that they give back, regurgitate what the polls say. And they are also used for true leadership purposes, because if you understand where the public is and you don't agree with them, you know how to address that issue. You know how to come to grips with it. And I've seen both uses by the same people all the time. And it is a mix of the two, and I don't think that you can ever unscramble. I don't think you can ever get rid of the manipulative element, and I think it would be a real service to mute these polls because they do have that other opportunity to create a dialogue. There's a dialogue with hundreds of millions of people. It's only possible if you can distill their views into a coherent whole so that a leader can be responsive to them, so that the leader can say, I understand what's on your mind, and here is how I respond to it. Either I think you're wrong, or I think you're right, or take this into consideration on the left. It's a necessary condition for a dialogue as our to-be Miss Presidential candidate, Mr. Fisher, has written about so eloquently.
We have time for 3 more questions. 5 minutes. We can have short ones, please. Graham?
Is whether the 3 pollsters see differences on the question of linkage, which my sense is some of the different polls conducted in ATS come out on different lines in that. With the American public, granted that they're cautious in terms of policy towards the Soviet Union, how far would they like to link changes in Soviet behavior with changes in American behavior?
I think we found that they supported linkage to certain external behaviors of the Soviet Union, withdrawing from Afghanistan, from certain Third World revolutions, but I don't believe we found that there was support for linking it to domestic reforms, introducing free speech or freedom of religion in the Soviet Union. I think that's where our findings were on the topic of linkage.
I understand the question. It was to what extent Americans see linkage of Soviet action with U.S. action. And if I understand the question correctly, the Americans tend to believe that we've done nothing wrong, that we don't have to change, and that they have to change. So in that respect, I mean, there is an implicit linkage in the sense that there's a willingness to reduce arms, to reach certain arms control agreements, to open our doors to verification if they open their doors to verification in that sense. But I think in the most fundamental sense, and this drives the Russians crazy, it's the attitude on the part of Americans that there's no need for us to change. That they're the ones that if there's going to be change, they're the ones that have to change.
I don't think there was no shortcut for linkage. I think it's a very gradual, step-by-step basis. I don't think there's any one specific event that's going to change American attitudes. And one of the most revealing survey findings was we asked the American people, what 3 different times, what if the Soviets left Afghanistan? Would you trust them more? 73% said they wouldn't trust them more. Then we said the Soviets had announced they're going to leave Afghanistan. Does that make you want to trust them more? 73%, 75%. No, I would not trust them more. And then we said, they're leaving Afghanistan. Does this make you trust them? And 73 or 74% said it does make you trust them. So if you want a snapshot of American opinion, their skepticism, that's one. It's going to move very slowly. There's all sorts of optimistic signs all throughout the survey there about how Americans look to the future and what they want to do. But it's going to move very slowly. Dan said it would take 10 years, and I agree with that.
The person in the balcony, please.
Yes, I'm obviously a young woman voter, and although I happen to be college educated, I feel that I also am afraid to take a risk with the Soviets. However, I think both candidates have shown that both of them want to go ahead with negotiations. So the thing that convinces me to want to vote for Mr. Bush is that he's the only one that can have the strength with the negotiations, and he's the only one that is going to make my feeling that the risk is very high of these negotiations to go down. Given that comment, let's just say I happen to be one of that college educated women, and I'm looking at things that way. It's very important. Economic issues are very important to me. However, I still feel that the Republicans are the ones that are going to maintain the strength with the negotiations. I'm kind of confused. How, Mr. Martello, can you convince me that with a lot of the programs that Dukakis is proposing on the social end of the scale, which I think are very important, and with the rising deficit, how, when it comes down to priorities, he's still going to convince me that we are going to maintain a strong relationship and stand up to the Soviet Union.
Well, I think you read a speech that he gave last week. I think that'd be reassuring. Again, what I'd like to say is that, possibly because of Ronald Reagan's leadership, there is now a bipartisan consensus about U.S.-Soviet relations, which is probably unmatched in the past decade. Dan would probably speak more knowledgeably. But in the ATS survey data, on question after question after question, Democrats and Republicans would have identical values, 71%, 63%, both parties right on the same attitudes. In America today, there are American values about how to proceed with the Soviets. And I think the one thing the Dukakis campaign may have underestimated earlier on in the campaign is how clearly they must speak to this issue. And the speech may have come late. Nevertheless, I still believe there are 6 weeks left. And I think the speech that was given 2 weeks ago spoke to American values. And I think to the extent that this issue is addressed further in the next 6 weeks, I think it will continue to reassure Americans that his values are consistent with American values. I don't think there's a great human cry out there that his values are inconsistent with American values, but I do think that the campaign should work hard to make sure that there is an agreement to common ground.
I have to break protocol and give a certain priority to a draft presidential candidate. You don't get many of them anymore. Roger Fisher.
Not at all. I want to know to what extent can polling make an issue become more salient? Can you, by asking the question, is economic strength more important than hardware? And you do that 6 or 7 times with people not knowing they realize that question. Can you make an issue become more salient? Can you ask, is making the world work a more important objective than being militarily having more weapons than the Soviet Union? As to what extent, if you ask over and over again some questions, but if you ask the question as a built-in assumption of U.S.-Soviet negotiators are being trained, is it more important that they be trained skilled in problem solving or in being stubborn? To what extent, by asking questions repeatedly, can you in fact illuminate the public that that's a different way of looking at it? I'm wondering what the economic security issue is an interesting one, as one example. Yeah?
The history of polling shows that pollsters tend to be late on issues. In other words, when an issue like AIDS comes to the foreground, and you want to go over certain environmental issues, you want to go back and see the history and questions on it. And you find that there isn't the kind of prehistory that you would have liked. So as a practical matter, it doesn't tend to happen. As a theoretical matter, I mean, if it does happen, it happens in this way. If you take an issue like the importance of the drug trafficking for national security, which ATS did on Earth, then to the extent that the media and the candidates pick up that issue, I don't think it matters. The number of people who are interviewed are so negligible that the influence on them doesn't count. But the influence on the media and the candidates can be enormous if you ask a issue. I think, for example, just coming back to my opening remarks, that if we asked more questions about ending the Cold War, and that was picked up, it would have by itself an influence.
Jerry Grossman.
Assuming that the candidates have been paying attention to your data, aren't you conscience-stricken that you helped homogenize this campaign? And second, on a technical basis, do you intend to do exit polling to match the reasons that people give why they voted for a particular candidate with the issues in which you're interested?
Second question, something else. The first question, speaking not as a representative of the caucus campaign, because I'm not in that position to do, but I believe that most of Mike's caucus's foreign policy decisions were announced and formulated before the ATS survey data became widely known or understood within each campaign. And furthermore, I think there are very sharp differences in foreign policy and national security in the caucus campaign and the Bush campaign. Very sharp differences, and I think that I think this is probably one of the areas where the differences are the most pronounced.
Oh yeah, I think that it sounds good, but it has no merit. The effect of the polls are not at all to homogenize the campaign. They just don't have that effect. So you're assuming something that isn't the case. What they in fact do is they give the candidates the issues around which they can express their disagreement as well as their agreement. And I think that there is an enormous difference between focus and homogenation. And I think that what these polls do is to help focus the campaign and not homogenize.
Just take one more question because it's getting late. Ron.
I wanted to ask a question to clarify views on Central America. Fred Steeper, you said that the president's done very well on U.S.-Soviet relations, but not well on Iran-Contra, I think. And John Martilla said that one of the key issues in the remaining weeks of the campaign is whether the focus will be on U.S.-Soviet or on, I'm not sure whether you said Nicaragua or drugs or Noriega or exactly what the other alternative is. In any case, what I'm interested in is what's the essence of American objections to the Nicaragua policy? Setting drugs aside, unless there's something that isn't obvious, a position in Noriega and drugs, what's the essence of American attitudes toward the Nicaragua policy?
In order to commit U.S. troops or to support military aid, certain things have to be proved to the American people. The Reagan administration never proved those things. They have not identified what government down there is a threat to our national security. People are very confused or lack the information they need about Central America in order for them to support the policies that Reagan has put forth. He just hasn't identified it as well as he did. He identified Khomeini and Gaddafi very well as enemies of the U.S. and therefore ran into a lot of trouble when he gave one of those two enemies arms. He's never identified who the good guys and the bad guys are in Central America.
There's been a huge amount of focus on clarifying Central America as a security threat and an issue, and we have Ortega with sunglasses and various other accoutrements as one of the 5 big villains in the world. I thought that was what was said. Why then is this reluctance to get the job done?
Well,
Ortega's not in the same class as Gaddafi.
no, he's not, but he's the bottom edge of that class. Right. I think that I believe that the American people look at this, and Fred can disagree with me here, or I was somewhat disappointed when I saw the survey that Department of Opinion Research did. I have been tracking, if you looked at all the survey research which preceded the ATS survey in Central America, what you found generally is 3-to-1, the American people, by margins of generally 3-to-1, were opposed to the Central American policy. And whenever you saw these surveys, there was rarely any kind of intensive examination of the underlying reasons why America opposed it. What I felt was that it was much more, it was less of a value judgment about the situation in Nicaragua, and what Fred said, more a question of whether we can commit troops and so forth. But also what Fred's survey proved to me was that the theoretical foundations for anti-communism have potentially are more powerful part of this argument that many of us who oppose the administration's policy might like to believe. One of the mystifying things to me to watch the Central American debate in the past 3 or 4 years is to watch these House votes. Look at the national surveys, 3-1 against. And then the House votes, and it's 2 votes this way, 1 vote this way, 3 votes this way. And I would ask myself, where's the political energy that it's coming from to kind of tie the House up in knots when the American people are against this policy 3-1? When the market opinion research survey, I felt kind of helped me understand that. I think that there is a, in fact, wasn't there a question about where communism posed the greatest threat in Central America, Canada, Europe, and so forth?
Yeah, the communism in Central America was a much greater threat than in Western Europe or in Southeast Asia.
Now, those are top-of-the-mind responses. People should not take these findings at face value, in much the same way that you shouldn't take any single finding in ATS at face value without verification. There's more texture to them. But I believe that the truth on the Central American policy lies somewhere in between the popular poll results, which show America 3-1 opposed, and the Reagan policy. I think the country is more muddling on this issue than we might like to believe, those of us who oppose that policy.
Let me add a very simple formula. The heart and soul of the opposition of the American people is no more Vietnamese. The closest we came to that was Beirut, Lebanon, and the president had to pull those Marines back real quick. We're not doing the Vietnam action in relationship to Iran or to Gaddafi. So that's the fear. And everything else, these are what my associates have said is absolutely true. But I think it has to be understood on the foundation base that that's the trauma that is informing the American reaction to South America.
I also believe that for those of us who have progressive viewpoints about a number of these issues, I think this is a fairly urgent moment. There is diminished support. We just finished a survey, ATSA, for U.S. foreign aid. The only way to fair way to characterize American attitudes towards U.S. foreign aid right now is lukewarm support. About 13 or 14% of the country wants an increase. About 40% wants a decrease. About 40% wants to keep it at the same levels. And a lot of the moral arguments that are used to support our policies, as an example of life policy, do not have as much energy. People are willing to say, you know, these are very worthy causes, but we just don't have the bucks right out. There's not, isolation isn't the wrong word, but there's a creeping something that's inside the ATSA that I think should concern us. I think that there has to, the Reagan administration has very skillfully set the agenda, and they use force as the major definition of this foreign policy agenda. I think that the humaneness of our national foreign policy agenda is at risk right now. Not totally at risk, but I think it's on some shaky ground. I think we have to fight back and try to reestablish some of these basic principles. And I was disappointed in Central America.
I think we have to bring the proceedings to a close. Some of us will be here to talk on for those who are interested. Now, the results from the public polls that we have taken that correspond to the sample survey that some of you have filled out can be obtained from here. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll read some of these. This will be a sample. All right, on the question, who is the top economic power in the world, where the public said the U.S. is 22%. This audience, if I'm reading this correctly, said 40%. Equal in wealth to other nations such as Japan and West Germany. It was 41% of the public, 40% here. Has less economic power than countries like Japan and West Germany, 34% of the public and 20% of this audience. I position that they had taken very clearly, which John mentioned, is the Reagan military buildup necessary or unnecessary? And about 2/3 will say necessary. 3 times it was asked. This version was intended to break that support, to see to what extent it can be modified by the way the language is used. And here the language is, since 1980, the Reagan administration will have spent $2.4 trillion on the military, more money than has been spent in any comparable period since World War II. Do you think this spending has been necessary or unnecessary for the defense of the country? And that did break the public majority down to necessary 46%, unnecessary 48%. And in this audience, 21% said necessary and 79% said unnecessary. Certain bias I can see there. I think that it's not really appropriate for me to go over this, but the public results are available in multiple copies, which you can pick up as you go out. And I have one more announcement to make, is that 2 nights from now there's going to be another forum on glasnost and perestroika. Will the reforms endure? Featuring Fyodor Volotsky, Richard Pipes, and Joseph Nye, 8 p.m. Wednesday, same place. And I want to thank my associates for their marvelous experience. They've given me